Today I'm speaking with Jonathan Pearce. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Hello.
It's so good to see you again. This is the third visit we've had.
Yep. It's like some kind of virus I am, but not hopefully a benign virus, not one like COVID.
Absolutely. Well, I was just reflecting that I have not done repeat interviews, I don't think, with anybody else yet. So the fact that I've had you on 3 times says a lot about just how much of a delight it is to talk to you every time. So we really appreciate your being a
You
part
know
of the
what?
channel.
I'm hugely honored, so thank you.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to give everyone a brief bio for Jonathan Pearce, and then we'll dive into our main topic, which is the resurrection. So I'm so excited to hear some of the things you have to say today. But just to get started, Jonathan Pearce is an agnostic atheist teacher, philosopher from South Hampshire, UK. And you're not far from the Isle of Wight, right?
No, that's correct. Yes.
Can you actually see that from your neighborhood?
Pretty much from almost my house. Like it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to the beach, and then I can see the Isle of Wight, which is a small island off the south coast of the UK. Yeah.
And if anyone hasn't seen that, that's a beautiful part of the world. And
yeah,
I'm a little bit jealous of that. And you're a student of all manner of things, philosophical and theological. You also have been focused a lot on the existence of God and topics related to the philosophies that come on both sides of that, from both the Christian apologists as well as from the atheist side. In terms of your education, Jonathan Pearce earned his degree from the University of Leeds, a master's in philosophy from the University of Wales, and a postgrad certification of education from the University of St. Mary's in Twickenham. I think I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, you're always good.
And you were a founding member of the Skeptic Inc. network before moving to basically becoming more of a blogger. Is that right, with Patheos?
So Patheos, so I was at Skeptic Inc. network blogging, and then just sort of I was not headhunted, but you know what I mean, come and write for us at the Patheos non-religious channel. And that's the biggest sort of interfaith discussion network in the world. So it's a real privilege to write there and do what I do.
That's awesome. And your blog is called A Tippling Philosopher. And for anyone that doesn't know, what does tippling refer to?
So tippling is having a little drink, right? So we're based on this idea. We started a group of pub philosophy group where we meet once a month, some friends and I, and we were basing it on the Inklings, which was C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and a few others who used to meet and discuss things over a pipe and a whatnot. So we meet and discuss all manner of things, and there's quite a disparate group of us, sort of believers, non-believers, sort of believers and whatnot. And so we were called the Tippling Philosophers. So when I started my blog, I was like, I'm a tippling philosopher. So there you go. So if I just crack open a bottle of beer or a glass of wine, don't mind me.
Well, I know that it's probably a little bit different, at least recently with COVID, but when you all are together, I'm curious, does it ever get heated or is it pretty friendly?
So there has been heated moments before, but all of us are good friends. So, you take it with a pinch of salt. And actually, I've learned, it was really interesting. I was on holiday in the Isle of Wight recently, and I met someone, and we had it was really interesting when you start talking about philosophy and geeky stuff. I put my feelers out when I meet people, like who's likely to be interested in talking crap that I'm interested in. And our kids were in the kind of amusement arcades, part of the holiday resort, and there was this dad who stood next to me talking about our kids, and then you put your feelers out, and he starts reacting and talking back to me about sort of politics and philosophy, and like within half an hour we're at the bar drinking a pint, and he's like, I always want these conversations, and none of my friends, none of my mates ever want to talk about this stuff. This is amazing. This is like the greatest night ever. And we had just and this is what I do, which is just talk deep stuff. And so we ended up spending a whole night, but that got a little bit heated at the moment because his politics were really quite opposite to mine. And his wife was apologizing to my wife, saying, I'm so sorry, I'm really embarrassed. He's really excited, obviously, and my partner was like, don't worry, he loves this. He's got this in hand. Don't worry, because you get used to dealing with people who react, who can't quite handle that you might have an argument back to theirs, and then they're left thinking, oh my god, and there's this cognitive dissonance going on, and it bubbles up in anger, doesn't it? I mean, you've probably had many arguments on both sides of the fence that you've been sitting in your life, and you probably have experienced anger, and it's just, when someone doesn't get our point or someone undermines us and we haven't quite got the acumen to deal with that, then anger sometimes comes out.
Yeah, and so much of it is so personal to people's worldviews, which I do hope to get to later in the discussion, but
Yeah.
it's very personal. Well, in terms of the rest of the bio too, you also are an author, which is amazing. You've written a lot at this point, including books on free will, the Little Book of Unholy Questions, the Nativity, Beyond an Absence of Faith, 13 Reasons to Doubt, The Problem with God, Did God Create the Universe from Nothing, countering William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, Filling the Void, a selection of humanist and atheist poetry, Not Seeing God, Atheism in the 21st Century. And then you've also got some books that are more from your personal perspective of a dad, Twins, a survival guide for dads. And then The Curse of the Maya. That's a trilogy? Is that right?
No, well, it will be. So we're just writing, as I said to you, I think last time, we're just writing the sequel to that.
Okay.
And loads of schools up and down the country have actually taken that on as a core text. So that's
awesome.
Really, really stoked about that. Yeah.
And two books, I believe, called Survival the Fittest, Adaptation and Metamorphosis, or I think I have those backwards.
And then, Adaptation. So that's a pandemic horror series that will be a trilogy or maybe four. But that's 2 books in, and that's great. I'd advise everyone go out and buy that because it's amazing.
Did you intend to time that with the coronavirus?
No, I like to see myself as a modern day prophet. So
yeah,
just telling it how I think it will become.
That's awesome.
So if people start eating other people's faces soon, then I've definitely got it right.
Yeah, well, we're going to be talking about zombies in Jerusalem, so later. So that's probably
great segue. That's a great segue.
And then, of course, the main one we're talking about. This is called The Resurrection.
I've got that too.
Yeah, look at that. A critical examination of the Easter story by Jonathan MS Pearce. So a little plug for that. I'll have the link for the Amazon page for that if you want to pick that up. And so what else are you working on in terms of literature? Is there anything else coming down the pike?
So I'm glad you asked that. This book is to be seen in the context of this book. So the Nativity, a critical examination, the Resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story. So as I've said to you before, these are looking at and analyzing the ways in which the Gospels historically or intersect with known history, right? And also how they work together in terms of internal coherence. So, as I said to you before, if you find that they fall apart in their claims that they make as far as historical credibility and theological credibility, and these are the only areas of the life of Jesus that intersect with known history, then what's it say about all this stuff in the middle? So do you have any epistemic warrant for believing the wedding at Cana, for all these different miracles? And it ends up just looking like, well, if you take this away, then Jesus is just some itinerant miracle preacher and they're 10 a penny. So, it's a bit of a problem for Christianity. If there's no resurrection, no nativity, Christianity falls apart. So now I started looking at the Exodus, because at the end of the day, Christianity is built upon the foundations of Judaism. And if Jesus is fulfilling every jot and tittle of the law, then what's this Mosaic law based on? What's a historical credibility for the Exodus? The Exodus is a hugely important part of Judaism and therefore Christianity. And the 10 Commandments and the covenant law and all this kind of stuff. And if you say, which I'm writing this book, so which is the Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story, as the end part of this trilogy, and it's fascinating. I'm absolutely loving writing it, but man, it is on shaky grounds historically and theologically and philosophically, like really shaky grounds. So it never happened, and we know that from archaeology, we know that from history, and blah 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 blah. So then you're saying, well, if the nativity didn't happen, and the resurrection didn't happen, and the Exodus didn't happen, what have you got left? What really, if we're talking about probability, if we're talking about believing things because they are the most probable explanation of the data, and I'm hopefully showing that that's clearly not the best explanation of the data and the most probable hypothesis, then what are you doing believing it? Then it becomes, then all you're left with is the psychology of religion, which you and I have talked about before, right? The belief in religion. So Tim Mills, you were a very committed Christian, but did you at the beginning, and we said this in the last video, but did you at the beginning of your life go through all the religions in the world and historically analyze them, philosophically analyze them, theologically analyze them, and then pick the most probable one? Or did you believe what you were born and brought up in?
Yeah, definitely the latter for sure.
And so therefore, once you do these analyses and then find you simply find that there is no epistemic warrant for believing in either Christianity or Judaism, and then there you go, job done.
Yeah, and it's similar to the whole idea of, the reasons that we would discount so many other religions when we were Christians, that is, the reasons we would say we don't think, this religion is probably accurate and reflective of reality, and that one. uh, we need to apply it to our own religion, and we don't, because it's we're so vested in it being part of our, culture and our worldview, and also part of our hope for what happens after we die, which is what we're going to talk about in part here. Just the This is, at the end of the day, this is not just about the history or the archaeology. This is about our very personal fear of death. We all
Yeah,
are aware of our mortality.
yeah.
Whether we get, just a few years, or we get a full 80, 90 years out of life, we know at some point our time is up, and there's a great fear of what happens next. And yeah,
Yeah, and
it's
sure.
hard to
And
let go of that.
we talked about that in the last two videos, actually, that the terror management theory, and the fact that when you unpick someone's worldview, you're not just unpicking those claims in and of themselves, but actually you're saying, if this isn't true, actually, then your access to eternal life isn't true, and that's a real existential threat to you. So you're not going to deal with this, or you're not going to believe what I'm rationally convincing you is true, because actually it threatens your eternal life, and that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
But yeah, so talking about the double standards that I think you were hinting at in the resurrection book, I do mention, actually, no, it's a lot in the Exodus book I'm writing. Very formally, John Loftus wrote a book called The Outsider Test for Faith, and he's got this outsider test for faith, which is the idea that you never apply the standards that you apply to other religions to discount them to your own religion, because by the time you believe it, it's got past the vetting systems, and it's all embedded. Whereas I would agree very much with Loftus to say that that's what you need to do with your religion. And in fact, in the terms of Christianity, there are huge amounts of double standards, and we'll come on to that a little bit later in terms of visions and hallucinations, and think about Muhammad and Sabbatai Zavi and all these examples where Christians will say, well, that's not true because of this reason. But of course, if that's the case, then you need to apply that to your own belief in the miracle claims that other people say are visions and hallucinations. And
It's
so
amazing, just in a real non-technical sense, just really generically speaking, when you step back from a lot of these stories, and you really just take them at face value, they do seem not just like they would need a lot of evidence, which it is true of that, but it's just this reflection that this is some weird stuff. Like, it doesn't seem as weird and fringe and bizarre because we're so used to it. And sometimes it's just, that's why Christians want to get kids while they're young. When you hear it, by the time you're 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, by the time you're 7, 8, 9, you've heard it hundreds, maybe thousands of times. The bizarreness factor is gone. And it's just amazing to me how people can't see how weird, even just, I
and
say it a
so
lot, but the simple thing of like a God who wants to cut off the end of little boys' penises,
yeah.
that is so bizarre, but we can't see it.
So I'm so glad you said that. You're going to love my Exodus book, right? Because I talk about this, and I actually bring in to the case some evidence, some research based on normalization and in terms of fake news. So the idea that fake news spreads 6 times quicker faster than fact, and the idea of social media at the moment in spreading fake news. And they've done a bunch of research to show that normalization makes completely ridiculous things actually not seem so ridiculous, right? So there's a whole bunch of research into that, and then you start applying that to the religious claims. You're like, Noah's Ark is mental. Actually, when you go through all the individual claims and what would have to be the case, which is water going to the top of the mountains, which means water all the way around the world. That much water, like literally, 5,000 meters of water all of it. There aren't enough water molecules on Earth. It would crush the Earth's crust. You would kill all the sea life. You kill all the animal life, which obviously is the case. But then you'd have to have 2 of each, and all these claims are just utterly bonkers. But of course, like you say, when you're singing these songs and you're hearing these things, it's completely normalized. And the same with the Moses story about parting the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, about the 10 plagues, which is absolutely terrible. You got genocide, you got the massacring of animals, right? Like God just wipes out all these animals, and because you've just heard the 10 plagues, 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 everyone knows about the plagues, right? Then you're like, so that's fine. It's kind of embedded. I don't really think about it. But then when you like really start unpicking it, if you were to have another religion believing that, and as a Christian, then someone came, you should believe this, and then you start picking out like the 10 plagues in the other religion, you'd say that's disgusting, right? God just destroying these animals on account of what the pharaoh said. Like Pharaoh says no, so I'm going to kill these animals. And God does that, and you're like, that's horrible. And let alone the firstborn children, let alone a bunch of Egyptian children. Like, unless you're really willing to say all Egyptian children were just inherently evil, which is just absolutely no realism to that. I mean, this is a theological story. This is a mythological, legendary story.
Yeah.
This is not what happened, obviously. But of course, Christians won't, and Jews in that case, won't apply the same metrics that they apply to other claims to their own.
Yeah. And it's amazing maybe one final statement on that from me is just not just the bizarreness, but the horribleness. You mentioned the slaughtering of the firstborn, or in the Noah story, slaughtering of everybody, firstborn, toddlers, old people,
everyone, but
everyone's you're just gone. The idea of how much of this you get used to, literally the idea of genocide.
Yeah,
you get used to the idea of land theft and slavery, and it's crazy. Well, I did want to ask, since we were talking about what we talked about last time, I did want to just mention, for anyone that didn't see our earlier interview, meaning the most recent one, we did touch on a few topics. That what I try to do for most of my videos is I put a little bullet point list of what we most likely, if I remember correctly, and if I described it correctly.
I've got them all listed.
Okay, yeah. No, I've got them here too. I just wanted to mention anybody, if anybody does want to go through it, just even if you don't want to watch the video, you could go to that video and just read the description part of it, kind of see if there's anything there that we talked about that might be of interest to you. And I apologize, there's not timestamps on them. I'm hoping to get time to do that in the future, but just to mention a few things here. And actually, before I do that, let me just mention this too. You mentioned the Exodus. I was just going to mention one last thing. For some reason, it's just the timing of it, must be a message from God. But I've been recently looking at some of the more astrotheological things related to it. And just in the past week, it came past my desk from Bill Darlison, who wrote the Zodiac and the Gospels. He's got that book, Moses the Matador, which is about the astrotheological side of it. And then, of course, Acharya, D.M. Murdoch, she's got a book on Moses too, and how it relates to the star stories. And it's just amazing. There's so much behind the scenes going on that we don't ever pick up on. And we read it as history, and we read it as if it's true. And being able to say this is a story, this is a literary character, is so critical.
And do you know what? That's perfectly right. Irrespective whether those claims hold up for the people you talk about, this is the idea that goes through all three books, that go through my Nativity, the Resurrection, and the Exodus book, which is, it's theology, not history. These guys are not writing history, they are writing theology. And these are narratives designed to deliver that theology. That's all you need to know.
Yeah, exactly. And just to highlight a few things we talked about last time, we talked about the idea of the elitist side of Christian apologetics, where apologists will insinuate that if you study hard enough, you read enough books, you talk to enough PhDs, you'll finally get the idea of how the atonement works and just the idea of how to defend your faith. But most Christians who don't get to go to Bible college and seminary, don't get to dive into all these books, they just have to take it on faith, and hope that the PhDs that defend the faith know what they're talking about. The competing theories of atonement, including penal substitution. We talked briefly about blood magic and Yom Kippur and the Paschal Lamb. The moral capability of the God character. A lot of talk about special pleading and begging that Christians do regarding these claims, which we'll probably touch on, I'm sure, here. How the Gospels are written in unknown places at unknown times by unknown authors, none of whom were eyewitnesses. Ex post facto agendas and all that stuff. Really important to understand all that. How the historical methods used by the Gospels is exceptionally poor. Again, the fact that the New Testament writers had an agenda. This is theology, and on it goes. There's a lot more points there, but I definitely encourage people to watch that video if you have time and interest. It was a great intro to this. And today, basically, we're going to dive into some more specifics. And I wanted to ask first, before I ask any questions, did you have anything regarding topics that we didn't cover last time that you wanted to start us off with? And then I'll bring my questions in after.
Well, I think it was quite a wide-ranging talk, but we kind of dipped into a lot without maybe going into a huge amount of detail. But I suppose we can start, and we did mention the silence of Paul, I think, a little bit, but maybe we can start with the silence of Paul.
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, Paul is our earliest source of in the New Testament of Jesus, right? So in many senses, he should be the most reliable source.
Can I, before you dive in, can I ask, can you add to that for anyone that doesn't know, when you say Paul was the earliest source, some people would say, well, wait, isn't Matthew first? Isn't Matthew our first source? Could you explain a little bit of the chronology behind that?
Well, so Jesus died, let's assume somewhere it's like 33 CE, right? Or 30 something, wherever. He was maybe 33 years old, but then it depends what your chronology is, starting with the nativity accounts. But in the 30s, he died. And then sometime after that, Paul came along and he was supposedly persecuting the Christians, and then had his road to Damascus appearance vision, actually, and he puts that in with all the appearances. So you had this interesting part in Paul where he says, here are the appearances and my one's last, but his was openly a vision, and so he's conflating visions and appearances. So maybe are the other appearances actually visions rather than wholesale Jesus appearing? But anyway, he says what he says, which is very little about the details here. And then probably sometime after the fall of Jerusalem, that happened in 70 CE, you've got Mark writing. There's arguments over whether it's before or after the fall of Jerusalem. I think it's after, but we'll park that. So it's probably in the early 70s, maybe, Mark writes the first gospel, and this is called Markan priority. So the idea that the Gospel of Mark is basically your main source for all the other gospels, and the gospels aren't independent attestations of the claims of Jesus. So Christians will tell you, look, we've got 4 sources, and Paul, we've got 5 sources for Jesus, for the claims about Jesus. And actually, no, you've got Mark, and then arguably Matthew comes later, and then Luke comes later, and then John much later, and they're all using Mark and each other as sources for the Jesus claims. In other words, they aren't independent at all. In fact, they're codependent. And some people postulate that there's this unknown source called Q that sits alongside Mark that they all depend on as well, but that's got lost or whatever. And then more recent people, you've had, I think, Mark Goodacre. Now, have you all? But anyway, Mark Goodacre is someone who is a New Testament scholar who would say actually Q didn't exist. But whatever. Point is that all of these sources depend on each other and Mark primarily for their claims. And it looks like Mark came along, and then each of the subsequent gospel authors embellished Mark due to their own theological agenda. So they're adding layers and layers and layers on until you get to John, who's got a completely different theology. And we'll touch on this a little bit later. So they look progressivly more legendarily embellished. But
it starts with Paul, really.
But before that, it starts with Paul. But the writing we have from Paul are a bunch of letters to various sort of churches around that had their own agendas and reasons. There are sort of 13 letters, but it looks like 7 of them aren't actually Paul writing, and they are basically fake news or whatever.
Can I ask this? If Paul, say we make the assumption that everything that happened in the Gospels had actually happened, ignoring the discrepancies, but just say that, whatever you could harmonize of it, that if that had happened, and then Paul came along, Paul gets saved on the Damascus Road, and then he, gets obviously messages from Jesus, but he also gets exposed to other Christians, a little bit from the apostles. But if he inherited all these stories and knew all this background, would it be fair to say that you would think that he would have included some of it in the epistles, meaning he would have quoted Jesus more or mentioned the virgin birth or something? Is that fair to say?
100%. So that's what I was going to start with. Is the point that exactly that. So these are Paul looks to be trying to convince various people of various things in his letters. I mean, so when you talk about writing, it's about audience, purpose, and form. So your form, as in what you're writing, your content, and the kind of genre of writing, if you like, is defined by who your audience are and what your purpose is, right? So, for example, Matthew, let's take Matthew, his audience are Jews primarily, and his purpose is to convince them to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, in very simple terms, right? So he's writing persuasive. So his form isn't an objective history accounts, right? His form is an evangelical persuasive text. Okay, and he needs to succeed in his objective of persuading his audience by using the most persuasive techniques he can muster in order to achieve his objective, which is considering the audience, which is considering that they are Jews. So he goes into the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and chooses things that will be particularly evocative to his Jewish audience and applies them to Jesus, right? So it's about looking at the form and understanding it in terms of the audience and purpose. And once you've done that, then you understand what you're reading. Okay, so in terms of Paul, it's who are his audience, various people around, but he's still trying to convince them on certain things. So he is mustering all the persuasive sort of ammunition he can in order to persuade them of X, Y, and Z. So it might be his, the first letter to the Corinthians or second letter or whatever is convincing them about some aspect of the resurrection. And you would think, here's your perfect time to cram in a little bit of empty tomb about this, about that, about how Jesus was buried, about the appearances. Nothing. You got nothing. In fact, I'm going to read you what Paul says, and this is the entirety of what Paul says on the resurrection, essentially. For I delivered to you as of first importance that I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. So actually, he's just kind of received this from somewhere, and that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. So it's according to the scriptures is super important here. So it's not only he's received it, but he's been told this because and it fits in with the scriptures. Okay, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. And basically, this is telling us that his sources are personal revelations, so from his own visions or hallucinations, and the scriptures. And kind of this nebulous kind of received these, but essentially it's from the scriptures. So this is really poor level evidence. So before you do anything, before you like analyze what he's actually saying, content wise, this is actually not very good evidence for the claims of Jesus. But also, this should be prime time for him throwing in a bit of, as we're talking about the resurrection, empty tomb, this happened. He mentions nothing about the empty tomb, nothing about anything of any importance with regard to the resurrection, other than it appears to be some way of paying for sins.
Yeah. And you'd think, this is just my first impression on this topic, but you'd think that if you truly had gotten a vision, a real vision, not something he made up and concocted, but if you'd really seen the risen Christ, and Christ had only said a few things to him on the road, why are you persecuting me? All this stuff where it's like, okay, I was persecuting this guy because I thought he was wrong. I thought this Christian religion was wrong. I thought Judaism was where it was at. Now I see Christ is real. Christ is the fulfillment of all this stuff that we had hoped for. Now I need to basically worship this Jesus is God. He is Yahweh. He's Yahweh's son. My most important mission now is to get to know him and to love him. Wouldn't you think that the very first thing that someone in that context would do is run to the people, just race to the people that were with him, his disciples, and say, I know 4 sentences that he said. Tell me, what else has he said? What else has he done? What have you written down? Clearly, this was, whatever time frame since he was here. What have you written down? Clearly you must have written something down. Tell me more. And it seems like he doesn't do any of that. Like, why would you not want to hear what he said?
One part I just disagree with you a little bit on is I don't think Paul actually thought Jesus was God. So I think Paul thought Jesus was an exalted divine being, like an angelic being. I'm with Bart Ehrman on this. So in how Jesus became God, he talks about exalted revelation. It's Jesus is an exalted figure, and I think it's not until you get to John where Jesus starts becoming divine, and actually this kind of fits in with what I was saying about the resurrection, which we can come on to later. But your broad points are absolutely spot on, and I think it's a huge problem. Yeah.
When you say what you said about the angelic elevated person, are you saying that you think they originally thought Jesus was a man who got elevated, or he was just elevated like an angel from the beginning?
Well, I think the early gospel writers, and therefore probably the Christian community, thought Jesus was the Messiah. You believe your leader, your sect leader, your cult leader is the Messiah, right? And you've got these Jewish ideas of who the Messiah is. So already he's not quite militaristic. Doesn't quite fit with the mold of what I might expect. Simon Bar Kokhba and all these other kind of more militaristic Messiah figures who were around at the time. So he's not that. Okay, but let's follow him. He's doing like miracles. We think he's awesome, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes and gets executed. You're like, and this is the cognitive dissonance. So what happened? In fact, if I can I share with you?
Yeah, should be able to. I may have to change the setting here 1 second.
Because I'm just going to share with you. Actually, it's another writer summing up John Dominic Crossan's views on how the Passion narrative kind of came about, and I think it's perfectly encapsulates how it all happens.
Yeah,
so, and then we'll get back to the silence of Paul. So, if I just share with you this, right? Can you see that?
Yes.
So the quote here is Crossan argues that the Passion tradition evolved through three primary stages. P1, the historical passion. So basically this saying, like, Jesus was, whoever the person of Jesus was crucified, he died, right? The prophetic passion, okay, how do we understand this in terms of the Old Testament? You know, this is cognitive dissonance happening. And then the narrative passion, so how do we write this down in terms of like the actual stories that you find in the gospel? So during P1, Jesus was crucified, but his earliest followers knew none of the details of the execution. This to me, this sums everything up so perfectly. So during P2, Jesus' disciples interpreted the meaning of the death in light of the Old Testament, but they did so without reference to the particular details of the Passion events. So what Crossan is saying here is that Jesus died, then his followers went away, looked at the Old Testament, and interpreted his death fully in light of that, without really connecting it to the actual actual facts of what happened around Jesus' death. And then during P3, Jesus' followers organized this complex array of scriptural proof texts into a coherent and sequential narrative, refining and augmenting the story with verisimile historical detail, which is to say that then they historicized the theology that they had trawled through the Old Testament to find and developed independently about this guy that died and the cognitive dissonance going on in their heads. How do we understand this? And basically they created the Passion narrative. Does that make sense? Is that
yeah,
a useful kind of?
It does. I was going to say it reminds me too of how when you look at a lot of the different literature of that era, there was often the idea of someone has a story and someone else elaborates on it, embellishes it, maybe turns the tables on the outcome. But that was very common with, with Homer and so forth, where especially with the Iliad and the Odyssey, where they would take motifs and storylines, and then they would come up with a different version of it that was maybe better. And it sounds like some of that's happening here.
Yeah. So in my Exodus book, I'm writing about, so lots of people, when you talk about parallelism, and you want to be careful with parallelism because you can throw too many things and say, look, the parallel here, and it's like, nah, maybe not so much. But when there are true parallels, and you say to Christians or Jews, say, look, here's what you've got written down in your holy text. Here's how it maps onto this pre-existing text. And they say, oh, but look at the differences. So it can't be drawing on that because there are differences. But the point is, and you said this yourself, the point is not actually the similarities. You get the meaning from the differences, which is say, yeah, I know this original story, and I'm going to take this story and I'm going to change it. And the way I'm going to change it is in this way. And that is what my audience will recognize. And that will deliver the meaning that I am trying to deliver. So it's not about the similarities, it is about the differences. But there needs to be the core amount of similarities there in order to recognize there's a parallel going on, of course. Yeah. But then you are changing that one thing to saying, yeah, I get it.
Yeah. And you even see that with the apostles in the beginning of Acts, where, if you have the background of like the Bacchae and these, these people that would get into these crazy frenzies and even tear people apart because they were so crazy with being drunk with wine and filled with the power of the gods, so to speak. And then, you get to Acts, and the first question is, why are you all speaking in tongues? Are you all, drunk? And he says, no, like, that we know that's what you're thinking, because it looks like this is some kind of Bacchaic craziness. It's like, we're not drunk. We're actually filled with the Spirit. We're going to take your story that you all know, and we're going to say, our God is even better. He is filling us, but he's not filling us to do damage. He's filling us to, proclaim the gospel. It's just taking the old stories and bettering them, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so to take that back to Paul, we have this silence, and it's worth saying that absence of evidence, you hear this claim, absence of evidence is evidence of absence, right? And I would say and we talked about this before, that, but then the Christian would say, well, just because there is no evidence for it, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's fair enough. But actually, when you would expect there to be evidence and there is none, this is a problem. So we talked about, like, if there's an earthquake, right, yesterday in your town, 7.5 on the Richter scale, and I'm making that claim, and that you look outside, there are no crumbled buildings, there's no one you speak to, and you are actually able to verify this, and there's no evidence for it, and nothing on the news, then actually that absence of evidence is evidence that my claim is false, is evidence of the absence of that claim. Yeah. So it is valid. So where we would expect Paul to be mentioning things, and I know there's a bit of conjecture here, of course, but and he doesn't say these things. This is weird, right? He doesn't mention the empty tomb. Then this starts fitting in with the whole nature of the embellishment of the narrative. So then you start looking at Mark. Okay, Mark does have an empty tomb. And then he finishes it there because after that, you know, it's Mark 16:9 onwards as an interpolation. Everyone generally agrees that's why it's in brackets in most Bibles. And then in each like subsequent gospel, you've got these appearance narratives that are embellished. But you've also got the empty tomb narrative embellished. Now, what's interesting here is that in Matthew, you've got the guard story, right? So, and I mentioned a guard story before. Matthew's guards at the tomb is something that is not mentioned in any other gospel, right? And this looks like it is a counter argument against the Jews, right? So, can I share again?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so let's just share this. So the Matthew story is that the chief priests were worried that the disciples could steal the body and fake the resurrection. So they went to Pilate and got permission to post the guards. And rather than believe Jesus, Jesus rose and then the guards witnessed Jesus. But rather than believe Jesus, having seen actual God supposedly rise up from death, you know, and they fall to the ground, they then go back to the priests and say, Jesus did actually rise from death. And the priests, rather than believe it, they say, oh, keep quiet, here's some money. And then they accept the bribe and then basically go away and they're never heard from again. So these would be perfect evangelists for like this nascent sect. And also the priests should surely be going, holy crap, this guy did rise from the dead. Do you know what I mean? Like, but no. So what this looks like in Matthew is that, and here's a conversation of how it might actually look as far as a way it developed, which is, and I'll say this almost like a play. So the Christian goes, Jesus resurrected from his tomb. Jew says, no, he didn't. Anyway, how do you know the body didn't get stolen? And this is a much more probable explanation, because there were guards at the tomb on the insistence of the Pharisees. Okay, but what if the guards were asleep? The guards weren't asleep. How do you know? Because we know they saw it. But why didn't they tell anyone? Why is this not known everywhere since this is a resurrection of the Messiah? Because the guards told their superiors and they were bribed to keep silent and they disappeared. That's suspiciously convenient. And the problem with that being so, you know, there are lots of problems. I mean, there had already been a full night that had passed before they organized this and blah, blah, blah. And no one says anything about this ever again as far as the Pharisees or the guards. Now, okay, so what this looks like is exactly what it is, which is Matthew had come across people reacting to the empty tomb claims, right? Jews. And we know that this is true because it's in Justin's dialogue with Trypho, right? So you have Jews at the time saying, no, the body was stolen. Of course, that's going to be your classic counter argument. So Matthew then writes in a counter argument to that counter argument to put this to bed. And he says, but it couldn't have been stolen because look, there were these guards. Now, interestingly, John, who writes later, doesn't include this. I think John realizes that this is just a load of guff. Mark doesn't include it. Now, here's the important part of this whole story, right? Mark doesn't include this because it's not a thing already. And the reason it's not a thing already is because the empty tomb story isn't a thing already. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now, the importance of this is to say that's because Mark is the genesis of the empty tomb story, right? And what this then says, this fits then with Paul being silent on the empty tomb. So Paul, who's your earliest source, is silent on the empty tomb. Why? Because it's not a thing. No one's developed this. Because, and this is another side part, because Paul actually doesn't believe in the bodily resurrection. He believes in the spiritual resurrection where the body stays where it is and transforms into a new spiritual body and then resurrects and leaves the body there. What the gospel writers after this are doing are reacting against Paul's theology and saying, no, this is a bodily resurrection, which is why John has, we talked about this a little bit last time, which is why John has the disciples poking him and him eating broiled fish and stuff like that. So they are reacting against Paul's theology, but they're also, Matthew is putting in a counter argument to the stolen body thesis of the Jews. But that counter argument wasn't already existent when Mark was writing, otherwise he would have included it. So this is all evidence that Mark develops the empty tomb story himself. He's the first instantiation of that story. It didn't exist in Paul, and is then embellished with a counter argument. So this gives time for Jews to argue against the empty tomb narrative, that they produce the stolen body thesis, that then Matthew comes along and says, oh no, we've got guards at the tomb. And then Luke and John, for some reason, don't include that for whatever reason they have. Maybe they think this is clearly just a way of Matthew denying the stolen body thesis, and it didn't really happen. Does that all make sense? There's a lot of me talking. Sorry.
No, it does. It's good. I was going to just add it from a Christian perspective. It's also very disturbing to understand these things in this sense. If we understand that God created us, and I'm obviously speaking as if I were a Christian still, but if God created us the way we are to be skeptical, so we would look at religion A, B, C, all the way, the 4,000-ish religions that we have, we'd say, I can look at that religion and I can see through it. I'm skeptical. And God says, yeah, you should be skeptical because it's not true. You should be able to see through it. And you can see through all these religions and say, I'm skeptical. I can poke holes in this really easily. This story falls apart so quick. You would think that when it comes to God's story, where he's like, this is the culmination of, I've been planning this for thousands of years. It's finally going to come together, like a glove. It's going to look so beautiful. That God, having given us the skeptic's mind, is going to give us this story that has so many holes in it that honest, just not people that just, I really want to sin, so I'm not going to bow my knee to Christ, but just people that are saying, no, I'm not trying to sin. I'm not trying to buck the system. I don't want to argue for the sake of being dramatic. I just really want to say, does this make sense? Skeptics can see so many holes in it that you think, wait a second, if this is divine, shouldn't this be orchestrated a little bit better than it's been done?
You're absolutely right. Hang on.
Yep.
You're totally right. And what this looks like is, and what it ends up, the reality ends up being that every single verse in the Gospels is problematic in the resurrection narrative accounts. Every single verse. So you need to do what Bart Ehrman always suggests, which is don't read a Gospel, one, then the other, then the other, then the other. You need to put them side by side. So you've got 4 Gospels sitting side by side, and you read each part of the Gospel simultaneously, or like you need to read these verses that are all recounting the same events with each other, and then you go on to the next event, and then you will see that they just don't cohere, and they contradict, and they have huge differences all throughout. The reason I got this book, this is a Michael Alter's book, right? This is 1,000 pages, right? It's a phenomenal book. It's a phenomenal book, The Resurrection of Critical Inquiry. I wanted to take this book, add some philosophy and theology, and condense it. And so I worked with Michael Alter quite a bit, actually. He's a tremendously decent fella. And I produced this book. I would say get both these books, obviously get mine first. But this is just so worth having at home to just dip into, because every single verse in the Gospels is analyzed in this in great detail, to show that, exactly like you say, if you're going to wait all of time to like deliver this amazing revelation, and the 4 sources can't agree on anything, then you I don't know, you're not very good.
Can I ask on that note, you're bringing up something, I wanted to look up a little list here as we were talking about. There are other gospels too. We've all heard of recently, the Gospel of Thomas is certainly on a lot of people's minds. There's, the infancy Gospel of James, and infancy Gospel of Thomas. There's Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Philip much later. Yeah. I'm just reading a few. Gospel of the Egyptians, Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of the Ebionites, the Nazarenes, the Gospel of Eve. There's all kinds of gospels, Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of the Savior, much later the Gospel of Gamaliel. But for the first 300 years, people are just writing gospels, but some of these are pretty early, like the Gospel of Thomas. I think some people have said maybe even come before, potentially before Mark.
Yeah.
And obviously people would say if there was a Q, that came even earlier, but they got the Signs Gospel earlier, the Gospel of Thomas earlier. How does
So,
that play into these stories? Like, do you think some of
well,
those were woven in?
it's problematic because you're accepting that in some sense there was an art. I mean, it's for the objective onlooker, in some sense, there is an arbitrary decision to put these four gospels together at the exclusion of all other writing, right?
Mm.
And once you understand that actually, well, the Catholic Bible looks slightly different to the Protestant Bible, and you might get a little bit of, you understand that there are people getting together saying, we think we should include this for this theological reason and not include that. And this is a human process. But now the question is, well, do you believe this is divinely inspired? Well, then you have to say, well, the Catholic version is like, God prefers my denomination to your denomination, or whatever.
Yeah.
But you've got an arbitrary demarcation of what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable that I think is hugely problematic.
And some of those decisions weren't made for hundreds of years after the fact as well.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the non-canonical gospels has some interesting claims about the death and burial of Jesus, saying that he was buried in dusty ground, in sandy earth, basically, which goes to there are certain theories to say that every decent theory should say that he was buried in a criminal's graveyard. Now, the question is whether that is a shallow graveyard, as you would get in many towns, or whether Jerusalem would have the need for something more more sustainable, given the amount of criminals that would be executed. So maybe some kind of necropolis of a criminal's graveyard complex, which looks a bit like a mortuary, where you'd have like bodies stored, and then after a year, their family can get their bones after they've been ritually purified, so that they can bury them in their own tombs if they so wanted or could. But the idea is actually we can take a phrase from this non-canonical gospel to say, oh, this looks like Jesus wasn't honorably buried in a tomb that Joseph of Arimathea just happened to have hanging around. So there are some interesting things that you can pick out of these, and where they date is it's a whole other debate.
Yeah. Well, it really does. It goes back to this idea of, if this was divine, this would be consistent, it'd be clear, it'd be undeniable, and it wouldn't require blind faith. It would require, obviously, faith in the sense of I trust in him as my savior, but none of faith is in these books are put together in such a haphazard way. We don't know what was preserved. We have no idea who was editing and copying them. Some of the the earliest copies we have are from hundreds of years after this all took place, supposedly. And you would just think, if this was God, wouldn't he do a better job? I mean, it's not even in the language they spoke. Jesus was speaking Aramaic. It's not even in his original language.
No.
It just looks so man-made to me.
I mean, anytime you got speech in any supposedly historical document, especially from this time when you couldn't record speech with a dictaphone or writing quickly on pen and paper, anytime you got speech, like whole of the Old Testament or most of the New Testament, alarm bells should be going off. Who's recording that speech? Who's remembering it? Like, how come we've got speech recorded of Jesus having a personal conversation with Pilate? Whoa. Okay, this isn't history. This is theology. You've got to understand these are people are writing stories. These are persuasive stories. So anytime you got speech throughout the entirety of the Bible, just your alarm bells should be going off and off and off. But this brings me on to verifiability, right? And you get this interesting idea that you get this two-pronged problem, which is, one, people didn't appear to want to verify things, to fact check. So we see in Acts, there are loads of these accounts of where someone says something broadly, crazily improbable and miraculous, and people go, yeah, brilliant, I believe it straight away. Right. So Acts is basically documenting how gullible people were, or how people didn't fact check at all. And the second problem is that people couldn't fact check. So you've got travel was too expensive, very time consuming, and oftentimes dangerous, whether on land or sea. Mail in any conventional sense was practically impossible, certainly from strangers. Library access was incredibly limited and of little use to the potential Christian convert, and most likely inaccessible. And given the near practical impossibility of foreign or distant travel from outside of Palestine, or even from far off places within, this leaves us with localized fact checking. The skills of interrogating were not known, let alone implemented, especially given the in-group secretive world of the nascent Christian cultural sect. So basically, you couldn't fact check.
Hmm.
So these gospels are coming out, and it's like, and then this goes on to like the idea that people were claiming that you know, if they were coming out with Jesus, there was an empty tomb, like the Jews would have fact checked. And they're like, well, hang on a second. No, they probably wouldn't, because actually they didn't start saying this until Pentecost, like 50 days later. And that body's rotted, and you are not doing any kind of fact checking around that time, you know. And plus it was actually illegal to do that kind of thing with dead bodies, so on and so forth. So you get this situation with fact checking that is really, really problematic, which means that basically, and these gospels were written after the fall of Jerusalem, where all the records are destroyed. So we can't check who was in the Sanhedrin. We can't check anything. Like, it's really fortuitous time for these guys to be writing, because they can make any claims. And even if they wanted to fact check, the audience couldn't fact check.
Yeah. And that reminds me of the whole idea of the 500 witnesses, where it's like, these people, number one, you don't name them. So who are these 500? Apparently none of them went home and wrote a big story about it and put it in the on blast. No historians were doing, saying, oh, this is awesome, I love your stories, give me tell me what you saw, and tell me your friends who were there, let me go investigate this and put this all down on history, in the history books. None of them are doing it. And then at that point, by the time it's even written, most, if not all of them, are probably already dead anyway, whether because of it's been so much time or the fall of Jerusalem. But like, there's so many witnesses, but I'm not going to name them, and they're probably already dead. So like you said, there's nothing you can do about it to verify this. And in addition, when you add the whole, we're talking about a hyper superstitious, a hyper mythologically based area of the world, where everything is blood magic, everything is angels, everything is levels of heaven, and the angels and demons are fighting. There's so much superstition behind the scenes going on that by the time you get to a point where, from our perspective, we're looking at this from, the 21st century, 22nd century, looking at all these issues where people are really starting to hype up the criticism of it. You look back at this and you think, these people weren't doing what we thought they were doing. They were, as you said, not questioning the narrative. And
yeah sorry,
good. Oh, please go.
Well, I was just going to say, when you've got, so just a little quote here, what can we learn from this chapter? So one of the particular chapters in my book: as with all other elements of the resurrection narrative, every claim appears to be flawed, whether it be 1, the time of day; 2, what Jesus said; 3, who was present; 4, what the details of the crucifixion were; whether 5, he should have been killed; and 6, buried differently; 7, who was at the empty tomb; 8, whether there even was an empty tomb; and 9, what happened thereafter. We are met with issue after problem, after discrepancy, after outright contradiction. And you can see that internally without even fact checking, right? But then you're saying, but you got to also remember that the audience of these gospels might not have had all the other gospels as well with them, right? So the audience for Matthew's writing for the audience, they get his gospel. They haven't necessarily got Mark, Luke, or John. Luke or John haven't even been written yet. Yeah. So they're not comparing these all together, are they? It's only till after John's written his all, and then someone seeks to combine these documents together into one tome, that you can then start going, hang on, this doesn't work. So therefore, the verifiability is almost a moot point, because they don't even realize that there are, certainly about the internal contradictions, they don't necessarily realize there are internal contradictions, because they aren't aware of these other texts at all.
Yeah. And the access, like you said, the access to these texts would have been limited, and the ways that they could have been manipulated and edited from the beginning. Number one, at this point in history, we would have no way to see what the original edits were. Like, what were the first 10 drafts like? Did they have any of this stuff? And I think, especially when you bring up what you mentioned about the Gospel of Mark, I mean, I think it's got at least 9 different endings. I mean, that's scary as a Christian to think the Gospel of Mark originally didn't even mention the resurrection, and now it has 9 different endings. Because the way I was presented the gospel was always, as a Christian, the gospel is not just that Jesus died, because if Jesus just died, yeah, he paid for sins, so to speak, under the atonement theory, but your hope is not that your sins are just paid for, because that just takes you kind of, in terms of a debt equation, that just takes you from you're eternally indebted back to zero. You now need a hope of glory. You need, Jesus to be the first fruits, the firstborn, who is going to carry the rest of the family, so to speak, into the glories of heaven. You need to know that he has paved the way, not just for your debt to be paid for and your sin is atoned for, but that you have a way to actually go to heaven. And the idea that a gospel would not just put the resurrection on blast and say, look, this is all culminating not just to some bloody, brutal, human sacrifice, but to the fact that, like all these other lambs and goats and turtle doves and all that we've been slaughtering for thousands of years, they're dead, their carcasses on the ground, their blood is everywhere. Jesus was the carcass that was the final lamb, but he is brought back to life. That's our hope of glory. Christ is going to take us just like he did himself. Just like God rose him, he's going to raise us. To leave that out is very concerning from a Christian's perspective.
So this shows that basically John, for example, has a massively different theology to the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Right. So for John, Jesus, and I don't know, I can't remember if I explicitly talked about this last time, but John is saying that Jesus is the Paschal Lamb, right? So, and this fits into the idea that, because like you were saying earlier, right? You imagine you're Paul and all the early Christians from there on after, right? And this is why Paul did grapple with this, and Paul's letters were dealing with this, which is like, right, what's my intention? To convince everyone I speak to come to Jesus, to basically not be a Jew, to be a Christian, okay, or to be this Christian sect of Judaism, if you like. So now here's a problem. If I'm Luke, right, and I'm appealing to Gentiles, this gets a little bit tricky, because I'm going to a Gentile and saying, hey, you should come and believe what I believe and follow who I follow and do the rituals I do. And this Gentile goes, oh yeah, that sounds really cool. Let's do that. What do I need to do? And I'll sign up. And then you say to him, well, actually, you need to cut the end of your penis off. That's the first thing you need to do. And then you need to do this. And it's because the Jews are full of all these ritual laws, right? 613 mitzvah or whatever, you'll be, hang on, wait. Well, what's that first one I have to do? And you'll be like, cut the end of your penis off. You're like, whoa, yeah, I'm doing that. No, I'm not. So the Christians had to. This is why Paul said, okay, let's not do this, right? And there was arguments about this, but essentially they wanted to drop the kind of Jewish rules and regulations to replace them with their own kind of understanding, or their own versions thereof. And one of them, so this is where John comes in, because I think John thinks Jesus is God, and the other gospel writers thought he's the Messiah. So he says Jesus is God, but not only is Jesus God, he's the sacrificial lamb, he's a Yom Kippur lamb, or whatever, and he's the Passover. We celebrate Passover by having a lamb, and we know from the Old Testament that you can't break the legs of the Passover lamb. So this then explains why John has Jesus being crucified on a different day to the others, literally on the Passover day. He's the only one that has that. And not only that, he writes into these weird things. So he says things like, let us not tear it, but cast. No, actually, that's something else that I want to come on to. He talks over there in John 19:32 about not breaking the legs of Jesus. So why is that important? Because actually, we know from other sources that you're not to have Psalm 34, but Exodus 12 here, you can't break the bone of the Passover lamb. So John is the only one that says the soldiers didn't break the legs of Jesus on the cross. Instead, they pierced him. And then the piercing bit fits in with lots of things that they go back through the Old Testament to look for, but they didn't break the legs. John's the only one that says that, because John has Jesus as the Paschal Lamb, right? So super, super important. In other words, John is writing theology and not history. And as long as you understand this, everything makes sense. So it's about going back through the Old Testament, finding the relevant things, and then or finding even irrelevant things that aren't prophetic at all, and then just applying them almost slapdash to Jesus. So you get these bizarre situations where in John 19, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it. These are Jesus' clothes, decides whose it shall be. Right? Jesus has just been scourged, right? He's covered in blood. He's then carried a cross, blah, 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 blah. He's been crucified. And then soldiers are casting lots. No one would do that for those bloody rags. It's just weird. And then you read Psalm 22, and they're like, for dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers has encompassed me. So those are the others on the cross around him, the other criminals. They pierce my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them. For my clothing, they cast lots. Now, this all makes sense in Psalm 22. But whack that onto Jesus, and you've got people casting lots for his clothes. And John only has that to validate Jesus in an Old Testament sense. But these individual activities that are going on in Jesus's passion narrative to kind of tick the boxes of Old Testament supposed prophecies are just bizarre, because they're writing theology, they're not writing history.
Can I ask for your thoughts too? In that you bring up a really good point. At this point, Christians typically not in just our discussion, but in the way that they speak about these things, they would typically say, this is evidence, meaning the fact that they didn't break his legs and they did cast lots. This is evidence that Jesus was fulfilling prophecy.
Of course.
Can you not see the amazingness, the divine aspect of this, where this had to happen, and there's whatever, hundreds of them, or even, I don't know if they even count thousands of them, but for sure hundreds of things that had to happen that Christ had to do. And look, he did them all. And obviously from our perspective, we're saying, no, this was a story. This is a literary character. There may have been a guy, but this is the way he's portrayed. There's a literary character. They're making it fulfill the story because they want to make it look that way. That has nothing to do with it actually being fulfilled prophecy. Do you have that kind of comeback from people, and how do you tend to address those conversations?
That's a really good point. Now, first of all, let me just point you back to John 19 here. And at the end, 35, he says, and he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that, and he's telling the truth, so that you also may believe. For these things came to pass to fulfill the scripture. Not a bone should be broken. And they blah, 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 blah. So John is literally admitting here that I am convincing you that this is true. And these things happened in order to fulfill the scripture. So he's almost being so upfront here that it kind of beggars belief. But then the Christian would say, well, this is still just fulfilling scripture, fulfilling prophecy. Then you say, well, okay, but these weren't prophecies in the Old Testament. So these things that you're applying to Jesus are actually taken right out of context. And most of the original sources of these verses are not prophetic. They're not prophecies.
Yeah.
And then they say, oh, they're still prophecy. And then you say, okay, and these ones that are prophecies were fulfilled back here, supposedly. And then they say, well, they can be double fulfilled. And you're like, really? You would? So I talk about this a lot in the book. I talk about how you'd have to set up the world in order for a double prophecy to be fulfilled. And you'd have to basically theologically determine the entire world. You'd have to make sure that humans sin so much so that and in such a way, and Jesus had to be born in such a way, you'd have to theologically determine the world until Jesus was crucified. Yeah. And all the philosophical and theological problems with that. But that aside, the Christian will still go, well, it's still prophecy, blah, blah, blah. It just depends how honest you are. It sounds a bit of a criticism, doesn't it? And it is a criticism, but it depends how honest you are. So you look at someone like, you look at the Old Testament scholars, Hebrew Bible scholars, people like Joel Baden, and they'll say almost universally, when you look at prophecies in the Old Testament and you look at them as objectively as possible, you look at the dating, you look at what they say, and all the prophecies are written after the events they prophesize, right? It's only really hardcore Jewish and Christian scholars that will put the events they prophesy and the prophecies before them. But actually, when you do form and text criticism of these a source of the source material, turns out that actually they appear to be written here, and these are just post hoc rationalizations of what they're prophesying. And we see this in other holy books or other cultures, and we know that's true, and the Christian will agree with that, but they don't like applying that metric to their own holy text. So you can just argue and just put your head in the sand and say, these are still prophecies. But actually, I think when you're being really honest with the sources, and when you're seeing how overtly theological the gospel authors were trying to be. These are just post hoc rationalizations. These are just trawling through, finding things that don't apply to Jesus, can't apply to Jesus, and then whacking them onto Jesus. Say, look, well, I'm validating him on the Old Testament. Yay, me. And
I had two questions real quick, from what we're talking about. You're just giving me so many things to think about, and I've got a bunch of sparks flying in my head as ways I want to take this. But two quick points. Number one, in the book of Galatians, Paul talks about Abraham. He's talking about Abraham and Sarah versus Abraham and Hagar, and he says these things are an allegory, meaning the way that Abraham, the Abraham-Sarah relationship with, they should have had faith that God was going to provide them Isaac. Instead, he tries to do it the human way with Hagar and provide a seed himself through Hagar. And he says this whole thing is just an allegory. I have heard, in terms of Jesus being a literary character, the idea that this whole story, the Jesus story, all of it, everything from start to finish, even if someone originally had a guy in mind, in the sense that there may have been a guy, there's certainly many guys who are apocalyptic messianic prophet people who some of them were magicians, some of them were doing some kind of healings or sleight of hand, but whether they had some guy in mind or not, that this whole thing may in fact be an allegory for the journey of the human experience, the human soul. Do you think that is what is going on in any of these gospels, in any part of it?
so two questions there. One, what was the intention of the author? Was that the intention of the author? And two, how would that affect what Christians believe now? And so I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with any kind of religious belief, as long as it's morally consonant with my own views, right? So if you're not going to morally change society in a negative way, you can believe what you like. If you are a decent human being doing decent things, you can kind of believe whatever you like behind the scenes, as long as that doesn't affect how this world works in any negative way, and how we educate our children, how we do this, and how we morally function, then that's fine. Believe what you like. So, and in some sense, I'm like, if you want to say that's an allegory, yeah, whatever. Where does that lead you as a Christian believer? Do you change? Does it change? I mean, I would find that really difficult, because then you're essentially if you're saying that of the historical claims of Jesus, then what are you basing the theology on? I keep saying this about the nativity and the resurrection books, is if you're getting rid of the history, then what are you hanging the theology on? Right. Otherwise you're just asserting theology. Fair enough. But then, if I've been really struggling with this recently, because I've been having arguments with Christians about, with certain liberal Christians who are happy to say, okay, the nativity didn't happen. Okay, parts of the resurrection problematic. Okay, the Old Testament's problematic, but it still tells this kind of truth, and there's still wonderful literature. It's like, yeah, but what are you hanging it on? Where's this all coming from? What's the basis of your truth claims and your theological claims if there's no history there to ground these claims? Then you're just making moral claims. And if you're just making moral claims, you're just being a secular moral person.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I think once you start stripping away everything to just relying on allegory, you are just making moral assertions. Does that make sense?
Do you think, though, that it was possible that the original writers, I mean, it's obviously every idea out there it's been postulated many times, but some people have said this was a play. This was literally just like they would have done a play of Dionysius and the Bacchae in front of hundreds of people in an amphitheater. The Jesus story was originally a play. Other people have said, well, we don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly could be like an allegory that was meant to be read. Do you think that it's possible that the original people literally were saying, look, if you take this as literal, then you're missing the point. This is a story, and you're supposed to see yourself in this story. You're supposed to plug your worldview into the Jesus character. This is a story. That's all it is. Do you think
I don't know. I think Paul thought Jesus died. I think, but from a prima facie reading, I think you would think that Jesus died and Paul had a vision of him.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's all allegorical, but I don't know. And I think certainly early Christians, but
we're assuming that Paul actually had a vision. We're assuming that Paul wasn't a literary character as well. What if Paul was a literary character and was Jesus? The whole thing is made up.
Well, there are letters. There were conversations between two different peoples. Uh, so someone was writing those letters, but
Yeah,
I don't. Maybe, but I would need to, because I haven't really particularly looked into this theory much. I would need some really good evidence of that.
yeah,
That is what happened, and also how that makes sense of the claims therein.
yeah. Gotcha. Another
Because
question. Go ahead.
yeah. Well,
Another.
if you want it to be allegory, it needs to work really well as allegory.
Yeah.
Obviously. So
Another question I had. This is kind of taking 1,000-foot view, but a lot of Christians, and we talked about parallelism, so this is related to that. But a lot of Christians do have trouble seeing the context of where these stories of death and resurrection came from. They were all very clearly aware of the Dionysian cults, the Eleusinian cults, but even going back to the Egyptians with the resurrected Osiris, you have all kinds of stories of these gods that it slowly seemed to have gone from like God is here to help you with your crops, God is here to help you as a nation, to God is here to give you a personal salvation. And so you're into identifying with your God, and it's the beginnings of a relationship of some sort with your personal God. But there's this whole context of, and obviously each story has nuances, and there's very big differences that you could point out, and Christians are very good at doing that, and that's fine. It's an important part of the story to say the Dionysius story looks similar in this ways, but it looks different in these ways. So there's some definite good points that they bring up, but in general, the context was everybody everywhere is talking about. I mean, we're talking about as far as India and China, all over, deep into Africa, all over even to Europe. You're talking about people all over that whole area that are saying, we have a God or gods that are promising us a resurrection. And if we need to identify with them, certainly into Dionysius, Mithras, all this, Osiris, lots of these conversations going on. And then you suddenly have a Jesus cult pop up in the same area as all the others are popping up, saying, I offer you a resurrection promise if you will identify with me. How do you handle those conversations with people when they push back on that?
well, I just think that no wonder it found fertile ground. So if you're going to be creating a story, so we go back to what John Don McCrossan said. So a bloke died, right? He had loads of followers that went through cognitive dissonance. So then they went back into the Old Testament to look for ways in which they could interpret why he died and kind of how he died, and then rewrite. And then they go through this stage of then rewriting his death in this new theological way, right? Of course, they're going to be drawing not only on motifs from the Old Testament, but motifs from what they know and from the cultures that are informing them. No one writes in a vacuum. No one thinks in a vacuum. You are influenced all the time by ideologies and ideas, and so it's absolutely unsurprising that you would find parallels, or you would find notions of this belief system creeping its way into what you're creating, because we don't create ex nihilo, like as far as ideas. Like when you invent a new monster, when you ask your children, oh, why don't you sit down and invent a monster, they're going to be inventing some kind of chimera, which is like has an aspect of this, an aspect of that, an aspect of that, because no one can invent a monster out of nothing, because you have no concepts to pull on. Right, you can't generate these new concepts that are just something that has no relation to the reality that you know. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? So therefore, when you're creating a narrative story about this divine figure, you are going to be pulling together parts of what you understand of how the world works from your received knowledge of the world, which is going to include influences from all the surrounding cultures. And
Can I ask a final question, then we can get back to the main topics you had on your mind? I was curious to hone in for a second on the actual 3 days. So you have this Jesus guy that, as you said, a bloke. I love that you're bringing in your British English. This bloke dies. He's crucified. He's horrible death, bloody, mangled, cut open. He dies. He gives up his spirit. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. It is finished. I paid it in full. He dies, and then dead people are. I'm sorry. At that point, there's the earthquake. The veil of the temple's rent, and then they take his dead body and bury it. And then 3 days later, the rest of the story picks up. But in those 3 days, historically, something's happening not historically, theologically, Christians have come up with the idea of what's happening. So what is happening from what you understand of what Christians would say? What is Jesus, not the dead body Jesus that's just dead and laying there, but the actual Jesus character that's divine? What is he doing in those 3 days? Is he going to hell? Is he just like gone for 3 days, like as if he doesn't exist, and then God brings him back? What is the importance theologically? Is that when he pays the sin, or did he pay it on the cross? And he's just, because I know I've heard stories where they talk about how he's actually at that point going to hell and like preaching to the spirits that are trapped in hell. How do you see that from what you understand of the background?
I would almost be a bit facetious to say it can mean whatever the hell you want it to mean, because actually that's what happens. So Christians go, oh, we've got a gap here. Let's plug in whatever I think would be really cool or make sense of my theological understanding of the world or whatever. So you end up getting all these competing theories about what Jesus did. And essentially everyone's just making it up out of cloth. But they're not making it out of cloth, because they're making it up out of their received understanding of reality and understanding of what Jesus would do, given that no one's told me what he does. So therefore, if I have this framework of who Jesus is, then what's the most likely thing that he would be doing? And actually, if something's a little problematic over here, like people in hell, it's a bit of hell as this kind of digital punishment understanding of the variety of sin on earth, and we can split this variety into heaven and hell, right? Then that seems a bit weird and problematic. So maybe I can have a bit of get out of jail free with Jesus going down there and doing some funky stuff. Fair enough. You make up whatever you want, because essentially, who knows? It doesn't really say in there. So therefore, I mean, this all gets down to whether you believe in disembodied minds or not. I don't. I think a mind is necessarily an emergent property of the brain. And if you don't have a brain, I'm sorry, you don't have a mind. And if you've got a problem with that, try and stick a fork in your eye right into your brain and see if it affects your mind. Yeah. I'm fairly sure it will. So, there is mind-brain dependence there. So, these things are interconnected. Whether the 3 days has some kind of symbolic meaning, almost certainly. And you can go to 3 being an important number and 3 days in all sorts of different places to pick out why that might have been a thing. But it also depends what gospel you read, right? Because the gospels have a different kind of chronology into how long Jesus was in there, when he raised and when he was buried. And so actually, it's problematic 3 days in and of itself, or at least in the context of what each gospel said.
I was going to say, on just a funny side note, I see some memes come through at times where it also just, if this was true, if this story really were the truth, then if you're talking about a God who existed from all eternity past, we in our hope as Christians, we exist from the time God makes us. And I know some Christians would say, well, maybe the soul existed before too, but at some point, most Christians think God created a soul, put it in your bodies when you were created, and then you now exist forever, either in heaven or hell, unless you've taken an annihilationist perspective. But you live forever from this point. But Jesus didn't just start living; he lived forever and ever and ever beforehand. And so the question is, okay, yeah, crucifixion is obviously a horrible, horrible thing to happen to somebody, and it did happen historically. We know that. But if you know that you've lived forever and that you're going to live forever, and on either side of that equation, you are the glorious God of eternity, is the 3 days really a big punishment? Like, it'd be a big punishment to say, Jesus, you're going to die and you're going to be dead forever. You paid the punishment for the sins and you are dead. The punishment was so bad, the sins were so grievous that you will have to die to pay for this, and then you're gone forever. That's a horrible divine story. But the idea that Jesus died for 3 days, if that, 2.5 days, it's like, that's not that much punishment for a guy that's lived forever and is going to live forever.
100% agreement. Like, you'll have no disagreement there from me. Like, I've written about this before, and about how the value of that sacrifice is very low. It's supposed to be an infinite payment. It's supposed to be infinitely bad, this sacrifice of Jesus, but to pay for the greatness of the sins of however people interpret it. But at the end of the day, if God foreknowingly like sacrifices himself to himself to sit to death for, you know, for 3 days to then sit on his own right hand in eternity for heaven forever, then you know, and that's a bit facetious and this is metaphorical and whatnot, but
Yeah.
at the end of the day, that's no great sacrifice. There are humans that have suffered worse sacrifices. But then people say, but this is God, and therefore, you know, it has a magnitude far greater than you could possibly imagine. It's like, well, if you assert it has, then I can't say anything to that. I mean, there's no good reason for me to believe that.
Hmm.
Like I've seen people in Afghanistan, like and in Britain and in every corner of this world, right, suffer greater injustices and suffer greater punish or like suffering, just have greater suffering than that. So
Yeah, it's amazing just when you step back from this stuff, and I know we're going to dive into some more here, but when you really step back from the details and just ask yourself, okay, I'm zooming in, I'm zooming out, zooming and zooming out. But when you step back and you're like, does this really make sense? The
that's
more
what I
that you
said to
pick
you
it
in that
apart,
first, yeah,
yeah,
that first interview that we talked about this book and said, well, the atonement doesn't make sense and the Holy Trinity makes sense. So, you know, you can forget looking into the details of the Gospels because all of it's incoherent. So
yeah,
you can
that's
stop it there.
good point. Well, thank you for entertaining my questions there. You can, whatever topic you want to go into next
Yeah,
is
I
good
was
with
going
me.
to talk about the capture and the trial. I'll just read you a couple of excerpts from other people's work. This is from Michael Alter, that big book I showed you earlier.
The capture meeting the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah, and well, mainly about the trial, right?
Okay.
So initially, the priests had just completed their busiest day in the year, the 14th day of Nisan, presiding over the organizing the slaughter of thousands of lambs in the temple, to say nothing of the obligation to attend their own Paschal meal. That very evening, because you're not allowed outside your house on Passover after Sunday. So that very evening, the evening of the Passover meal, they were to leave their families in the dead of night and assist in the arrest of Jesus. Second, the Synoptic Gospels reports that the Sanhedrin held 2 trials immediately after the arrest of Jesus. It is not plausible that the Sanhedrin would have convened twice, once in the night and once in the morning on the 15th of Nisan. Now that the evening had started and the Passover Seder had commenced, the chief priests and the elders were supposedly going to leave their families in the dead of the night and participate in not 1 but 2 trials. Further, those present at the trial were not just the chief priests and elders, the scribes and members of the temple guard were also present. Mark 14:55 went so far as to state that the trial occurred in the presence of all the council, the entire Sanhedrin, and the chief priests and all the council sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death and found none. It is totally implausible to believe that between 60 and up to 100 people would have left their Passover meal, leaving their families and guests in order to participate in 2 separate trials. Okay, that's Michael Alter. This is an Attorney General of Israel, so a Jewish legal expert. Okay, his name is Chaim Cohn. The trial is incompatible with multiple well-established provisions of ancient Jewish law. In fact, the violations of Jewish law in Jesus' trial dogpile on each other so fast it's hard to keep up. All of them are virtually inconceivable and, of course, highly improper. Neglecting Passover, meeting by night, holding trial in a private home, conducting a trial in secret, the high priest acting as interrogator himself and even striking the defendant with his hand, the failure of the witness to agree, mocking and beating the prisoner, and many more, any of which should have resulted in a mistrial. Even worse, they appear to have deliberately misrepresented certain aspects of the trial to paint the Jewish religious leaders as stereotypical villains. Now, remember, the Romans are let off the hook, and it's the Jews that are the ones that killed Jesus, as particularly John, but the gospel writers is anti-Jewish polemic rather than anti-Roman. So there are other less obvious implausibilities as well. Luke has the beloved, it goes on and on and on. So, and then another quote, to just kind of put the nail in the coffin, this is from me: the whole trial of Jesus was itself illegal. In addition to those claims above, we can argue that there are further impossibilities. 1, trials could not take place in the evening. 2, nor on a Sabbath or other Jewish feast days. 3, nor could they be brought in a private home. 4, nor could they convict a man without witness. 5, nor without any charge, as per Luke. 6, one could not execute a man without a death sentence, since the Sanhedrin did not condemn him to death. And 7, death sentences could not be pronounced until at least a day after the interrogation, to name but a few of the illegal trial issues. And then even, you know, I could go on, and this is from Richard Carrier. So none of this really works, but the more devastating point is that none of these dates is even possibly true. Under Jewish and governed by local treaty Roman law at the time, executions could not be performed on holy days. Trials for capital crimes by the Sanhedrin, as all the Gospels depict, had to be conducted over the course of 2 days and not and could not be conducted on or even interrupted by a Sabbath or holy day, nor even ever conducted at night. The gospel trial narratives violate every single one of these rules. Their authors thus did not even know or didn't care how Jewish law in early Roman Judea worked, and can't have been recording anything that actually happened. In the historical reality, had Jesus been arrested during or immediately before Passover, he would have been held over in jail until Sunday morning and could only have been convicted on a Monday evening at the earliest, days after any Passover could have occurred, blah, 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 so on, so on, so on, so on. Jesus could have been convicted by trial, but not how the Gospels depict in any conceivable way.
Yeah, it's
so
wild embellishment.
Wild embellishment, and those kind of things, like the knowledge of certain Jewish practices, are a real thorn in the side of the Gospels, right? So, how Jesus was crucified, he would have been stoned. He would have been stoned and hung on a post as a deterrent until sundown, and then taken down, right? But he wouldn't have been crucified. That's almost certainly wouldn't have happened. But Gospels have it a different way. You've got the anointing of Jesus' body. I think Mark has the woman going to anoint him in order to embalm. Anointing and embalming are two different things, right? And you wouldn't have happened twice. It's just complete nonsense. And then it looks like Matthew and John correct what Mark say, because Mark gets it wrong, and having their own kind of weird scenario of embalming. But then how would they go to a tomb and move a tombstone? Like, especially if they're women. I don't want to be sexist, but you've got all these. This didn't happen. It's theology. It's not history. It's theology, not history.
And you bring up the anointing. It's fascinating too how that story is well known to have come from, with the talk referencing the Dennis MacDonald work, but coming from Homer with Eurycleia, where her name in the story is the woman that is washing Odysseus's feet. Her name is known far and wide. And then when the woman anoints Jesus, it says, "You, for having done this, will be known far and wide." It's like he's literally taking her name and making it from Homer and making a play on words on it. It's amazing.
And someone like Luke, who would have been very well versed in Greek literary history, right? Being an educated sort of Greek writer, would have known these would have been texts he would have been really, really knowledgeable about. And so it fits. Yeah.
And that's what sometimes makes me wonder if, because you'd assume that the hoi polloi that haven't been educated in all the Greek classics at that time, they would have missed some of this stuff. But the people that were, for whom I would assume they were writing it, and I know that a lot of this is,
So Luke's right for Hellenized Gentiles. So these are probably dropped in for them to go,
yeah, they know they're encouraged to probably, excited to say, I see what you're doing there. Yeah. I see what you're doing there. You're talking about the stories we already know, and you're making the story better.
The question then becomes is would Jesus have actually said that to her washing of his feet? Would he actually have said, "You'll be known far and wide"? No, because that's a mechanism that Luke is using to appeal to his Jewish audience. It's not something Jesus is saying to that woman there in order that someone's stood in the corner, recorded. Sorry, what was that? Jesus, say that again. No. Okay, and then written it down, and then somehow it's got written into Gospels later, so that it appeals to a Jewish, to a Hellenized audience who are reading the Gospel according to Luke or whatever. You're like, this is so contrived. Obviously, it's theology, not history. Theology, not history.
Speaking of embellishments, I think I may have asked this before, but if I didn't, that's fine. The 500, the saints that come back to life in the city. Could you give us more background on what you think might have been going on with the rationale behind putting that story in there?
So I'm really annoyed because I spend a lot of time talking about particularly Matthew. So Matthew he's the only one that has the zombies, and he's the only one that has the earthquake. I think Luke has a renting of the veil, and I think there's darkness as well. But basically, Matthew, none of them have them all. Only Matthew has the zombies, which is the interesting one, because he also very clearly says, and everyone saw them. So you've got the zombies going around Jerusalem, and everyone saw them, and it's like that never happened. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence, because you could damn well be assured that there'll be someone in the history, Josephus, if he knew about like zombies parading around Jerusalem that everyone saw, that's going to be written everywhere. Let alone the darkness, let alone the renting of the temple veil is a huge one. Like, that's huge for Jews. Like, if that had actually happened, that would be documented. And of course, the darkness for 3 hours. None of that appears anyway. But what I'm annoyed about, and I can't give you the info because I haven't researched this myself, but someone was saying the other day that it looks like, and Matthew again is one writing for his Jewish audience, but I think Ezekiel's death involved darkness and an earthquake. And if I'd known that before writing my book, that would have been in there, because that is pure Matthean. Like, that's exactly going to be like Ezekiel, who is one of the main, one of the big dudes, is or if it's not Ezekiel, it might be Elijah. So it's basically one of those important figures from the Old Testament who dies, and then there's an earthquake and darkness. It's like, there we go, right, thank you very much. The Jewish audience is going to be like, yeah, of course, I get that.
So I was curious, when you look at the resurrection story afterwards, there's a story where Jesus is walking along the road, and he's already arisen. So he's at this point, the exciting part is started. He's now about to finish up his time on earth and go back to heaven soon, but he has a few appearances, so to speak. He has the time when he's speaking with the disciples, first without Thomas, and the well-known story, Thomas doesn't believe, and then he comes back to make sure Thomas can actually put his fingers in his hands inside, but then says, blessed are those who believe without seeing. But one of the cool stories that comes up in this is Jesus is walking along the road, and there's these two disciples who basically they're downcast, they're sad. And the man, Jesus, the character, he acts like he doesn't know what's going on. And he comes along and he says, why are you downcast? And they say, well, don't you know what's going on? And they begin to tell him what just happened with Jesus and this horrible death. And, their hero is now gone. And then the Jesus character, doesn't say, well, by the way, I'm that guy, that this is me, I'm here. It says that he doesn't apparently look like Jesus to them. He's either hidden or something, but they don't recognize him for some reason. And he begins to expound to them from the scriptures all these amazing things that Jesus had to do. Like, he had to fulfill these things, to fulfill prophecy, to fulfill salvation. And then, Jesus suddenly disappears, and it says at the end, their hearts just burned within them. That's such a fascinating story to me, because I'm intrigued by the idea that they couldn't recognize him. And I was curious if you ever had any reflections on that.
Yeah, so I've got a big section on this in the book. This is fascinating. So again, theology, not history. Just remember, theology, not history. So first thing can be said is this Luke drawing on that Greek knowledge that you mentioned earlier? So this is a quote from Robert Price, who says, my guess is that Luke intends a punning reference to the name from the Odyssey, that of Emmaus, which is, so this is called the road to Emmaus, isn't it? So Emmaus. And there's arguments over where that actually is, near sort of Jerusalem. But Emmaus in the Odyssey is Emmaus, at least as we would now transliterate it. And he says, so my guess is that Luke intends a punning reference to the name of the Odyssey, from the Odyssey, that of Emmaus, the faithful servant to whom Telemachus and Odysseus reveal their secret identities, as Jesus does it to the Emmaus disciples. So here you've got a very famous example in the Odyssey that Luke definitely would have read 100%. And arguably, as you mentioned, Dennis MacDonald say he's actually using aspects of such writing. And here we've got, the reality of, so you've got several problems here, because you've got this situation where Jesus has just been scourged, crucified, covered in blood, blah, 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 complete state, right? And then buried in some way. And you would think some kind of decomposition going on. And then he raises, but he raises and appears to people perfectly fine again. However, he does have some wounds in his hand. So it's like there's been a rewinding of how injured he is, but cherry picking some wounds that still remain. And you're like, whoa, so this is just bonkers. And then you've got him walking alongside two Christians, so two people who knew of Jesus, who eventually come to recognize him as Jesus, but not recognize him, walking, telling stories, and they only recognize him when they sit down and break bread together. And as the way he breaks bread, now I recognize you. And all this is theologically set. This is clearly theology to say that, I recognize Jesus in the breaking of bread, and this is to do with, Jesus being kind of, it's the Paschal, is a Passover replacement, but where like it's almost, this is replacing the Passover meal. It's not like Jesus is the Paschal lamb in the sense that John would have it, but the whole kind of, this is the Eucharist is replacing the need for a Passover meal. And this is, Luke doing a bit of theology. So I just read, can I quote?
Yeah, go for it.
Talked a lot. So the most obvious issue with Cleopas, who was one of the named disciples, and the other disciple being appeared to, is that they did not recognize Jesus. Jesus had been beaten, scourged. It is worth noting that Luke misses out the detail in his account, forced to wear a crown of thorns, and did not have any of his clothes, and was only initially wrapped in linen. He was how he was not recognized in this state. His body must somehow have transformed back to what it was before he was crucified, and his clothes magically rematerialized. This is bizarre, but with the supernatural, you can make anything up and claim it's true. And then I go on to say what the Christian might say, and say far more likely, as ever, is that this pericope is theological and not historical. We might ask how two people could walk all the way conversing with Jesus in broad daylight and then sit and eat with him and not recognize him. We would be more reasonable to answer that this was something that happened, not something that happened, but was as a story of theological value. And that theology is about the Eucharist, the meal shared in Christian ritual, as well as the idea, I was blind, but now I see. Not recognizing Jesus is a common motif in these appearance accounts. It happens to John's Mary Magdalene, who thinks he is a gardener, and to John's fishing disciples, who do not recognize Jesus when speaking to him until the beloved disciple does. In terms of theology, it looks to be the retelling of a story motif that happened in the Hebrew Bible with some frequency, such as the Genesis 18 and 19, Joshua 5, 13 to 15, and particularly Judges 13. Indeed, so I then go on to talk about some of these stories that look like Luke is pulling from the Old Testament to retell these kind of stories of people not recognizing and then recognizing after certain events. And so yes, 100% this is theology. It's not history. And then when you look at where Christians then say Emmaus actually is, and the only way they can marry it historically is by finding a place that is actually much further distant than the Emmaus is in the Bible, because the Bible actually says it's like 80 stadia away or something, and it's actually not that in reality. So there's just huge of historical problems with this.
Yeah.
And it just points to, well, it's obvious theology. To me, as an outsider coming in, I'm like, well, this is clearly a theological story. This is a lovely little story that is telling that Luke is trying to tell you something.
Yeah. Have you ever read anything by, I think it's Tim Freaky? I need to learn how to pronounce his name, but
yeah,
he talks about even the two Marys at the cross. Like, I feel like there's such a need for a scope for the imagination for people to see that there's so much more going on in this text. And as Christians, we were always pushed for, you need the context. Don't just pick a verse and think like God's talking to you. Get the context. And yet so much of the actual context was kept from us. But like when you mention Emmaus, the road on which Jesus is walking, or the road to Emmaus, and then you're pulling the quote from Robert Price about, there's a character named Emmaus. You look at, we talked about Euryclea, the woman that was washing Odysseus's feet, and her name means far and wide. And then what happens when someone is anointing Jesus's feet? Well, it says immediately what she's just done will be known far and wide. You look at things like Plato has a character in a story named Timaeus, and who does Jesus heal from blindness? Well, the character is called the son of Timaeus. You look at the Bacchae, and their singular would be Bacchaeus, and who's up in the tree, just like the king. Remember back in the Bacchae, this king really wanted to visualize the dryads or whatever that were just going crazy with their bacchanalia, and eventually they, it's a trick and they rip them to shreds at the end. But he has to climb a tree so that he can look down and peer at these crazy ladies going nuts with their wine, and they're being filled with the god. And then so they're each one is a Bacchaeus. And then you look at, well, who in the New Testament is going to climb a tree? Well, what's his name? Zacchaeus. It's like Bacchaeus, Zacchaeus, Timaeus, Bartimaeus. Eurycleia, the same thing, but written
So
out.
yeah,
It just it goes, it doesn't
I
end.
almost read you a bit from a Neil Godfrey article that looked at
Please.
Emmaus, but just to kind of go on to that point. So what I was going to say is when Jacob was traveling the sunset, early Jewish legends explained the point of reference to in Genesis 28:11 by saying God had caused it to set prematurely to force Jacob to stop there, and he had a dream that he was in the presence of God. God spoke to him there, and the name of the place was originally known as Luz. In the Septuagint, so that's a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it is Ulameus. In the Codex Bezai, this is the name used for Emmaus in Luke 24. In an early reading of Luke, perhaps the earliest, the Emmaus Road revelation happened at the same place that Jacob dreamed he was visited by God. So using that same place. So the name is super, super important. And if you know your Hebrew Bible, or at least if you knew the Septuagint, then that would be really, really important. So he goes on to say the most common motif was a resolution of the narrative through a gradual series of recognition scenes at the end. Throughout so many plots of novels, characters' identities have become confused, changed, or lost. And it's this carrying on of that motif, and then your eyes are suddenly open. They understand this understanding of it's just a really common motif, which you see in the Old Testament as well as the New.
I love that you're bringing that. I know there's so much more to in those notes, but I think what it does is it whets your appetite to say there is clearly more going on, both at a surface level, just in terms of names being picked from earlier sources, from from Homer or Plato or whatever, but also and from the Old Testament, but also there's just more going on in terms of the whole story about how they evolved this.
Here's a funny thing. So I told you about. It's funny. So like authors do this, and I did this. So I've written The Curse of the Naya, right? And we're writing Grease Lightning, which is set in Greece, which is the sequel to that, right? And we choose our names really carefully. I've never really thought about this. So we choose the names of particularly the bad guys, but actually the daughter in that's called Verity, because she's always seeking truth and blah, blah, blah. So all the names that we choose are really carefully chosen because they all have like a bit of a wordplay punnage that if the audience is interested enough or observant enough, they could find out that little I'm doing that. I just naturally do that as an author, not because this is a well-known technique, and it is. It's obviously a motif that other many authors use, but of course these authors might well be considering exactly the same thing, which is if I'm creating a narrative, let's make these names mean something, has theological significance.
And it's funny that we all know that happens, like you say, because as Christians, besides the Bible, one of the first books you're given to read is the Pilgrim's Progress, which is kind of this naming, this nomenclature mentality on steroids, where every person's name means something, and they even sometimes don't even try to hide it. It's just like, the name is clearly spelled out, but we see it even to this day with stuff like, the Matrix, Morpheus, Trinity, Cypher, Star Wars, Darth Vader. Like we know these names have such clear meaning to us, and yet to assume, well, clearly the Bible must have none of that because it must be reality, is just you're begging the question.
It's the problem of hyperliteralism, right? That I think just and it's such a shame, because actually when I'm doing all this stuff about the Exodus, right, and when I read it as myth, it's brilliant. There's I'm getting the illusions, and I'm getting the kind of what the author's trying to do here with some of these like interesting narrative, like theological ploys or naming or this and that. It's like and taking this myth from another surrounding culture, but just changing it a little bit. It's like that's great. I really appreciate that. I can appreciate that for truly what it is, which is how an anthropologist or a historian would look at any text that they're not invested in on a personal level. So if you're a Syriologist, or you're a scholar in the ancient Near East, and you're looking into the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you're like, this is so cool, and I love how the author's done this, and that joy you get out of reading it that is separated from like, I have to believe this is hyper literally true because I'm an adherent of the cult of Gilgamesh, or whatever. Like you somehow lose a bit of the joy of the reading of the writing by being constrained to a literalist understanding.
It's interesting too. I would ditto that, but it's like there's almost like an evolution of your stages. When you're a Christian, obviously it's all true and you love it, and this is your Lord and Savior and his love letter to us and his book. But then when you start to deconvert, you're like, this is a little bit suspicious. I don't know. This doesn't sound right anymore. And then you deconvert and you're like, this is just all, it's just not true. Like
Yeah.
you're not even ready yet for the emotional response. You're just like, I don't think this is true anymore. I think this is just made up or false.
But then
And
you
then you
come
get
back
like, we
to
get
the
angry
audience.
next. You're like, why
Yeah.
did you guys lie to me? I'm so angry. I hate this book. It's bullshit. And then, like you said, you slowly get past that and you heal and you go back to it. And you're like, now that I see with fresh eyes and I get past my, identify the Stockholm syndrome I was in as a Christian, I can kind of see through it all. Then you do what you do, where you're like, oh, okay. So if I identify this as just a purely human book by some guys who were very well read, obviously, they knew a lot of stuff. They were, a lot of them were
Some of those
Pythagoreans.
gospel claims are brilliant.
Yeah, Pythagoreans. They were well versed in the Greek classics. They wove all this stuff into it, and in my opinion, a lot of astrotheology. They're doing some really cool stuff behind the scenes. That's arguably some of it they want to stay hidden for at least some of the readers. But you go back to it with those eyes, and you're like, this is pretty cool. It's not
Yeah.
reality, but it's pretty cool.
You're appreciating it in a very different way. And again, it's like considering audience, purpose, and form. Once you just understand that the triple pillars of writing, then you just get this appreciation that opens up, saying this is brilliant. What they've written is brilliant here. I mean, it's not true, but the thought that's gone into it, and the interconnectedness of some of these ideas, and the way that they've used that source, and the way they've taken the old the Hebrew Bible and manipulated some of the thinking and some of the stories, and then reformulated them. I mean, this is the rabbinic tradition of Midrash and Pesha, which is to retell stories in a current way to make them more valuable, I suppose, for the audience that they have at that particular time. There's an important part of the rabbinic tradition. So it's almost like, that's how it should be. It's not literally true. But I know we've talked for an awful long time. I was wondering if we could just pop onto just a little bit about visions and hallucinations. I think I hinted before to you that I had a problem with like putting a load of store in like hallucinations, because I think it's a bit of a cop-out, before I really started looking into the evidence of hallucinations and how prevalent they are across cultures and time, and particularly, as you say, more superstitious cultures. That they're hugely important, but I want to point out the double standards at use. But first of all, here I think what we need to establish when you look talking about the appearances to various people and whether they actually happened as whether they were appearances of an actual Jesus, the body of a Jesus, or whether they are visions or hallucinations, and therefore if they're visions. So you could differentiate visions and hallucinations here, with being a vision being an actual objective phenomena here that I'm seeing that might not be the body of Jesus, but there's something going on here, or a hallucination, which is more in here, that I'm seeing something there, but I'm hallucinating it. It's not really there. And if someone else came along, they wouldn't see it because they're not me, and my brain is generating that for my brain. So what we start with is, one, people really do have visions and hallucinations, right? Two, people really do lie about having visions and hallucinations. Three, people really do mistake experiences as visions and hallucinations. Four, people really do misrepresent memories and represent them as misformed versions of what they originally experienced. Right? None of that is controversial. Okay. So what's more probable, that someone like Paul was actually having a vision of Jesus, or that he was having some kind of hallucination that we know people do, and that could itself be represented as something different, and it gets misformed over time to becoming this whole event that never really was the event that originally took place.
And can I throw in, do you find much evidence for there being substances, drugs being used for some of these?
Yeah, you mentioned this in the last chat. I mean, I don't know.
I know too, the fasting, like food, just depriving yourself of food for a long time can do some things to your brain too.
there are going to be conditions that where you don't know what condition Paul was in, traveling on a hot, dusty road, blah, 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 dehydrated. Who knows? I can think of huge amounts of naturalistic variables that are going to, influence the likelihood of you having experience that you might not normally have had sitting at home, fully fed and fully watered.
Yeah.
So here's the problem I have. If as a Christian you are to dismiss hallucinations as applied to Christian claims as somehow not worthy or too out there as an explanatory tool, then you're in serious trouble, because the same logic and arguments could be used to defend almost every other foundation of religion in the world. And the Christian will be using the hallucination argument to dismiss these. So Christians, beware the double standard. I cannot belabor this point enough. To dismiss visionary hallucinations out of hand is to take away your major rebuttal of all the other claims of visions and appearances in every other religion, religions that you do not adhere to, given your use of these sorts of hallucination arguments that you do not allow to be applied to your own religion. So am I communicating that clearly enough?
Yeah.
So if as a Muslim or some other religion or cult is going to say, we had these experiences, I know people that had these experiences, and the Christian will go, they're just visions, they're just hallucinations. My religion's the only true one. If you are finding it's okay to do that to that claim over there, we can do that to your claim.
And that would even go another direction too, with the idea that if you believe that Jesus does have the ability, obviously, to speak to people, he does have the ability to give you a vision and a message from heaven, then if that's true, that's how Christianity kind of got kicked off here through Paul, then those of you who would say God isn't still speaking today would have to really, you're putting yourself in a bad spot. You're like, this is a major way that God speaks. He spoke to the prophets this way. He spoke to Paul this way. God is a God who gives visions and he gives messages. So if you're telling me that this book is just done and God isn't speaking anymore, and I know there's verses like in Revelation, it says, don't add to the words of this prophecy or you're going to get the curses therein. But the canon wasn't closed for 400 years after that was written. So several hundred years after that was written. So it's like, okay, if you really believe that God is a God that loves to speak to people and give visions, then who's to say it stopped? Why are you arbitrarily saying Revelation was it, when there are clearly people who are writing, books from God? Again, we know there was epistles being written.
It's how do you draw that demarcation, that arbitrary demarcation between canon and the non-canonical gospels, but also between, the canonical experiences of disciples and the experiences of people nowadays as disciples. Some mega church, someone running a mega church could be having just as valid a vision, and they would say they are, but other Christians would be like a bit dubious. If you can be dubious about that person having an experience, you can be dubious about the first person who's in the canonical gospels as having an experience, a bona fide one.
And it brings up to the issue, this is a side, but I think it's an important aside to just touch on, the idea that this narrative that we're talking about, the whole gospel narrative, the death and resurrection and everything that happened after that, this has been heavily scripted and controlled and edited and manipulated. Pretty much men with power, with political motivations, with the willingness to literally fight and kill each other over who's right and wrong for first for decades and then eventually for centuries. They got to craft what books went in, which books went out, which books were in but got kicked out, which books were kicked out but got pulled back in, which verses were added later.
Christian has to say that those people were divinely inspired.
Yeah.
Because if it's just a human kind of process, then you are humanizing it, and it opens it to being incorrect and arbitrary.
Yeah.
And
and how Bart Ehrman points out that, like, there was a lot of Christianities. What is Orthodox today? I know there's different versions of even that, but whatever you consider Orthodox today, that may not even have existed at the beginning. It may have been a later interpretation that became the more powerful one.
If I can take on that vision idea to now apply it to Muhammad, so so saying the double standard idea of other religions, let's look at Muhammad particularly. So one of these reflects actual reality, right? One, the archangel Gabriel really did appear to Muhammad for some divine reason. 2, Muhammad really had hallucinations that he interpreted as revelations from God. 3, Muhammad did not have hallucinations and made the whole lot up himself. 4, the story, including Muhammad, has no basis in reality to begin with. In other words, it's all made up. So you either have, it really happened. 2, Muhammad had hallucinations that he thought were based in like divine reality. 3, Muhammad existed, but you made it up. 4, Muhammad didn't exist at all, but it was completely made up, right? So one of those 4 definitely happened, right? If you're a Muslim, you believe the first one. If you're a Christian, one of the middle 2. If you're a kind of a Muhammad mythicist, then it'd be number 4, right? So for the Christian, 2 or 3 are true. 2 and or 3 are true. In other words, as mentioned previously, they are happy to place either outright deception or falsely attributed hallucinations as visions at the foundation of a massive world religion, right? This is a plausible scenario for Islam, but not for Christianity. It's huge. This is huge, right? The Christian will happily do what the skeptic does to Christianity to Islam, but say that the skeptic is not warranted in doing that to Christianity.
Yeah.
So
the outsider test for faith again.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can start looking at actual real world examples of this happening that look very like, other than Islam, other than Muhammad, that look very much like the Christian scenario, which is Zabbatai Zavi, who is a Jewish Messiah figure from, I think, the 1500s, that had a huge following, and they went through cognitive dissonance because he became an apostate to Islam, right? And what happened was a cognitive dissonance. You had loads of miracle stories coming out of it. You had loads of visions and appearance stories and all sorts of stuff that looks exactly like the Jesus story that's just mapped onto Sabbatai Zavi. But this really happened. Like Sabbatai Zavi, these are, you know, he was a Jewish Messiah who we know quite a lot about him. So in fact, after he died, there was a group called the Donmei, his wife and 300 followers, who immediately outwardly converted to Islam, so to follow their leader, but kept their Jewish faith and Kabbalistic beliefs secret. This is how they harmonized the dissonance. So this is how my husband and my leader became a Muslim. So, oh my God, how do we deal with this? Well, we'll become Muslim as well, but actually we'll keep our secret beliefs and blah, blah, blah. And then what happened is, so here's quoting a history book on Sabbatai Zavi. So, but the excitement surrounding him quickly burst forth in the most sensational manner. Outbreaks of prophesying, visions of the prophet Elijah, reports of miracles, and massive penitential movements erupted in both cities. Letters written by both Jews and Christians in Aleppo and Izmir have been reaching Europe for months. The earliest ones were reports of the reappearance of the lost 10 tribes of Israel and their long exile beyond the mythical Sambation River. A clearer picture emerged as Sabbatai's name and alleged miracles were transmitted, enhanced by copyists, and passed along to others. Nathan's missives, and Nathan was his #1 dude, right? Nathan's missives were likewise distributed and studied. Right, this is going on to my analysis now. Nathan of Gaza had seen Sabbatai Zavi in a vision and believed he was a Messiah. Nathan Sevi, Messiah, visions, miracles, letters. If you can't dismiss the claims of Nathan that he wrote himself in 1673 of a vision due to the risk of double standards, then that should lead you down the Jewish rather than the Christian path. These accounts are written with more detail than Paul's letters. Therefore, if you dismiss the claims of Sabbatai Zavi, you should also be dismissing Paul's claims. Let that sink in. So if you're saying that there weren't these miracles and these letters were kind of in some sense not reflecting reality, and if there weren't these visions, and if all the followers weren't doing these things or didn't have the basis in reality, then you can take your criticism, which Christians would say 100% of all of these accounts of Sabbatai Zavi. If you're happy with doing that, you should be happy to do that to Jesus. It's double standards. Yeah,
all over the place. That's a great perspective. I appreciate you bringing that in. It's so needful. And we've touched on probably the high points, but there's endless other examples, whether you're talking about Apollonius of Tyana or going back further. There's all kinds of other stories that people have believed in with all their hearts at the time, and they knew that this was ultimate reality, that this was their God, that this was his messenger. And so much of it at this point is ancient mythology that nobody pretty much believes in.
Yeah,
And it's like we just keep on thinking, yeah, but ours is different. And it's like
yeah,
you can think that, but you got to at least entertain that there's a good option. There's a good chance that maybe it's not that different. And it's amazing to
yeah,
me when I look at apologists, I've been more exposed more to a Christian apologist in the last year than I have in a while. But the more that I look at them, the more that I feel like the charlatanism and the lack of willingness to talk honestly about these issues is so sad. And
yeah,
I feel like you almost need to help Christians to understand they're not helping you make a logical decision. They're just helping you to, to basically dig your heels in further and just you kind of put your fingers in your ears and go, la, 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 I'm not listening to you. Those of you that have left the faith or that never believed. And as much as that feels safe on some level to be like, I have all these people around me, my pastor, my apologist, who just tell me, no, no, there is so much evidence for the resurrection. There's so much evidence for Jesus. To be willing to step back from that edge just a little bit, even just in theory, and say, will you entertain? There is so much more to be said about
yeah.
these than the apologists. I mean, they're very selective about what they talk about, how they describe it, what evidence they let in. It's like
How they control the debate. Yeah, yeah,
it's like they want to be the judge as well as the the attorney, but they want to be the judge that just keeps on saying, I'm not going to let that evidence in. That's not admissible. And it's like the more that they do that, the more that I think people who are Christians, who are honest with themselves, should be willing to say, not only does Christianity not sound right, but you apologists who claim to be are acting like judges and dismissing all this evidence, now you don't sound right either. You sound like you're
yeah,
trying to pull something over my eyes. And I don't like this. I deserve the full information, then I'll make up my own mind.
yeah. And yeah, and I think, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to sort of pimp this book, but
Yeah.
that it's books like this and nativity that should hopefully, we have still only touched the surface. I mean, we've talked at great depth to some degree about certain aspects of this, but there's so much more, as you're saying, there's so many more allusions that could be made to other stories, but also so many more incoherencies between all the gospel claims that it's
Yeah.
just yeah, just. But the problem is for Christians, you open that door ajar, then you've got a full risk of that door being swung wide open, and then all
Hmm.
sorts of stuff going wrong. Yeah,
Could I ask to take us to maybe a more personal aspect of this to wrap up?
yeah,
Um, what we're
yeah.
talking
Because my
about is
boy, one of my boys keeps knocking on the window. He wants me to go outside with him. I'm like,
gotcha. I'll make this the last question, then we'll call it a wrap. Um, what this does effectively, besides all the issues we've talked about and touched on, it ends up bringing it to a very personal issue of I'm afraid of what happens when I die.
yeah,
And one of the big issues for me when we talk about what Christians are doing to people with their worldview and their dogmatism, there is a sense in which they're effectively depriving people of the ability to, number one, process their own pending and inevitable death, and also to process the death of those who've loved us, who've already passed. When you are a Christian and you it's like, let's say my dad, for example, he died about 2 years ago. If you're a Christian, you are thinking, I need to kind of grieve because I expected to see him in life and hope to have a few more years. Obviously, we all want a few more years, but he died now, and I'm sad. But I'm not really sad, and I don't really have to grieve this. I don't have to grieve like the pagans, to borrow the biblical terminology, because he's not really gone, and I will see him again. And it's almost like when you deconvert later and you realize none of this was real, it was mythology. It kind of hits you again like a wave, like, oh my goodness,
but
he's actually gone. Like he's gone, gone.
that allows you to realize the functional benefit, I suppose, of that narrative in the first place. I mean, that's the reason why that narrative exists, because do you know what? It makes the world a better, nicer place, feeling like a nicer place to you. It's akin to the just world theories. The just world theory is that everything's just, and people, because humans can't abide with things being unfair. Unfairness is horrible. But the problem is the world is deeply, deeply unfair. The universe is unfair. The universe doesn't care about us. So if we as a species wipe ourselves out, whatever. But that doesn't sit well with the human proclivity to fairness that we all have. I remember when we had just moved into this new house that we're in now. Well, we've been here 7 years, but I remember we came in, there's this big sort of range oven thing that we'd never had before. One of these sort of big, you probably all got them in America because everything's so big. But no, one of these big sort of oven things. And our boys were going around the kitchen on a wheelie chair. And one of them pushed the other, and it went straight into the oven and smashed this oven door, right? So I was looking online. I was like, oh my God, they don't make this oven anymore, and no one's got this oven door anymore. And so we're going to have to get a replacement. These are like £1,500, £2,000 for a whole new oven thing. Oh my goodness! And Helen, my partner, who's not religious anymore, she was like, oh, it must have happened for a reason. And I wrote an article on this because I found it really interesting. What happened? We had a little discussion, and it turns out that her mind was just justifying this happening because she naturally couldn't handle that such a crap thing had happened, and shit happens, right? So as a secularist, she was going, there's some justice in this world that means that happened for a reason. If that hadn't happened, then this wouldn't have happened, type thing. And she's justifying this by that bad thing happening. And that's just natural for the humans to do. So then you look at like death, and why does good stuff happen to bad people? And you start inventing heaven and hell in order to justify the unfairness of the world, right? And so it has that functional benefit, and it makes sense, and that's why it exists. And in mimetic theory, and like memes are ideas that, and if they maintain, it's a bit like genes. If they convey an advantage, or there's some kind of positivity to the idea of that meme, then it will maintain through time. So this is a mimetic kind of network of heaven and hell that maintains over time because it conveys an advantage to those who believe it. And they have some kind of comfort from heaven and hell, and some kind of idea that the world really is just at the end of the day. Yeah. So just the world theory is hugely important.
And like you said before, the terror management aspect of it. And I absolutely understand it. I guess I would just say, I don't think it's fair to deprive people of the ability to let them make up their own minds. Like, in other words, if you could say, well, if you're stuck in that, Plato's cave and you're watching the shadows, and that just really gives you, I'm just so happy with the shadows. That makes my heart jump. But I think
wishful thinking versus reality.
Yeah, most people I think would want to know what the reality is. They'd want to be unplugged from the matrix. I would think.
I don't know. I don't know if I'd agree. I would arguably, would some people, if it gives them more comfort, some people are probably happy to live under an illusion.
Yeah.
I guess that's the question.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one to look at.
Maybe we could save that then for another time, because I'd love to dive into that more with you, but it is fascinating to think about. Are some people better off without escaping religion, even if it's completely mythological?
Yeah, so the key there is to very carefully define what you mean by better off. Right, because so they could be better off in certain ways, but not in others. And are those ways more important than those ways? So, I did write a paper. In fact, I've got a book coming out. I've written a book, but I've been waiting till this has become embedded. And the book is called "Why I Am Atheist and Not Atheist." Right, so why I'm atheist and not atheist. Very clever use of the title there. But I go right from the beginning of like what are the abstract ideas made up of, to on ontology, to epistemology, through to natural theology, to morality, right? And at one point I ask in the book, can you believe things that are false? Are there good reasons to believe things that are false? Which is essentially this. So I have dealt with this in a chapter to an upcoming book. But it depends how you define. It depends what the long-term consequences are to believing false things. And it depends how you find, being better off and those things. So
we'll put it on the counter at some point when that book comes out. I'm going to get a copy, and we'll make that a topic. I think that's a great one, because I think a lot of people that deconvert do question, because they can see that the Christians that are stuck in it overwhelmingly, it's like you want to tell them, why did you leave? Why aren't you still a Christian? And your very existence as an atheist, even if you're very passive in it, the fact that you don't go to church and don't believe and don't care about it anymore, it's a threat to them. And so to be able to just think through those issues, I think could help a lot of people. So I'll look forward to that conversation.
The problem is, like, lies and mistruths can hurt, right? But reality can also hurt. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, so plagues and, what's going on in Afghanistan at the moment, or the coronavirus. Right? This hurts. This is hurting people. This is killing people. So, but that's reality. So either I go, damn, that reality sucks, or I could go, damn, reality sucks. What can I do to make it better? How can I cope with that by actually trying to make it better in my own small way? Or do I go, but it's all okay because I'll be fine in heaven. And so will all the people who died of coronavirus and in Afghanistan. Those kids will be in heaven.
Yeah, that's where pops into my head the opium of the masses concept.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, well, it's good to talk to you. I know we got to wrap up here,
Always.
but thank you so much. We've been speaking again with Jonathan Pearce. I'll have the links again to his books and his website. Thank you so much.
Buy them all. I don't care if you read them, just buy them. Maybe buy 20 of each, especially this one.
Support Jonathan. We look forward to your next books too, and thank you so much. It's always good to talk to you.
Yeah, cheers, man. Thanks,
Jonathan.